Waffle House 3 months ago, I was doing what a lot of us do. It was 2 a.m., the world was quiet, and I was falling down an internet rabbit hole, scrolling aimlessly through Reddit. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a distraction. And then I saw a thread that stopped me cold. The title wasn't flashy, but it was direct. It read, "Waffle House workers, what's the worst thing you've seen?" I clicked. I don't know why. Morbid curiosity, I guess. I expected stories about drunk customers and kitchen mishaps. What I found was something else entirely. The screen glowed in the dark room as I scrolled through comment after comment. Stories of wage theft, so blatant it felt like a joke. Descriptions of violence that were stomach-churning. Accounts of food safety practices that made me physically recoil from my screen. And a persistent, ugly thread of racism that seemed woven into the very fabric place. I saw a comment from a server who talked about having to choose between buying her kids' medication and paying the weekly rent at her motel room, all while the company she worked for was making billions. I read a story from a cook who described being threatened with a knife by a customer, only to be told by his manager to just get back on the grill because there was no security to call. I saw post after post from black customers who were refused service, harassed by staff, or assaulted by police inside the restaurant for simply being there. I finally looked up from my phone. The sun was starting to rise, and I felt a pit in my stomach. This wasn't just a few disgruntled employees or isolated incidents. This was a pattern, a dark, repeating pattern that was too consistent to be a coincidence. What started as casual curiosity at 2 in the morning turned into a 100-hour deep, an obsession. I started pulling court documents. I filed information requests for health inspection reports. I spent weeks tracking down and interviewing former and current employees, many of whom were terrified to speak on them. I cataloged hundreds of news articles, police reports, and viral videos. I wanted to understand. I needed to understand how a place so many people love, an American icon, could harbor so much darkness. This video is the result of that investigation. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand why Waffle House's business model doesn't just create cheap waffle. It creates a perfect storm of exploitation, danger, and systematic problems that affect every single person who walks through those yellow doors, whether they're an employee trying to survive or a customer who has no idea what they're really paying. Let me paint you a picture. It's 3 a.m. You're on a long, dark stretch of highway somewhere in the American South. You're tired, you're hungry, and then you see it. That warm, inviting, almost heavenly glow of the yellow Waffle House sign. It appears like a beacon in the darkness, a lighthouse for the weary and the hungry. For millions of Americans, Waffle House isn't just a restaurant. It's an institution. It's the place you go after the bars close, the place you stop on a long road trip, the place where you can get breakfast for dinner. The coffee is always on. I've been there. I remember a road trip through Georgia with friends years ago. We were exhausted, driving through the night, and we saw the sign. We pulled in, slid into a vinyl booth that was probably a little sticky, and ordered scattered, smothered, and covered hash brown. The waitress was a blur of efficiency and exhaustion. The cook moved with a practiced, almost robotic grace behind the counter. It felt real. It felt authentic. It felt like America, and that feeling is by design. Waffle House has cultivated this image for over 60 years. With more than 1,900 locations across 25 states, it's a cultural touchstone. It's so reliable, so famously always open, that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, literally uses it to gauge the severity of natural disasters. It's called the Waffle House Index. If a Waffle House is closed after a hurricane, FEMA knows the situation is dire. Green means the restaurant has a full menu, a sign that things are getting back to normal. Yellow means a limited menu, indicating a lack of power, or red means the restaurant is closed. That means catastrophe. The company is so integral to the fabric of American life that our own government uses it as a barometer for societal collapse. This is a company that does billions in annual revenue. A company that is, by every metric, a wild success. But here's what doesn't make sense. If this company is so successful, so beloved, why did that Reddit thread exist? Why are there so many stories of pain and exploitation? Why does a place that feels so much like a community hub seem to be failing its community, its workers, and even its customers on such a fundamental level? That was the central question that drove my investigation. I started to dig, and I spent the next 3 months diving into a world I never knew existed. I read through the fine print of wage and hour lawsuits. I spoke to labor organizers who were fighting on the front lines. I analyzed years of health inspection data from counties across the country, looking for patterns. I cross-referenced news reports of violent incidents with police records, and what I discovered was a pattern. A three-headed monster of systemic failure that kept rearing its head, no matter which location I looked at, no matter which state. The first head was labor exploitation, a system of wage theft so effective it was brilliant its cruelty. The second was a culture of violence and neglect, where both employee and customer safety seemed to be an afterthought. And the third was a deep, persistent legacy of racial discrimination that has stained the company's reputation for decades. These aren't separate issues. As I would come to find, they're all symptoms of the same disease, all born from the same deeply flawed business. A model that prioritizes low prices and 24/7 operation above everything else, including human decency. To understand the first part of this story, you need to meet Cindy. Cindy Smith. When I spoke to her, her voice was weary but resolute. She's a grandmother, a dedicated worker, and she's given nearly 30 years of her life to Waffle House. 3 decades. She's seen it all. She's trained countless new employees, worked holidays, dealt with every kind of customer imaginable. You'd think after that kind of loyalty, the company would take care of her. But when I asked her what it was really like to work there, she told me something that made my stomach turn. She said, and I'm quoting her directly from our interview, "They say we are all family, but when your family needs something, they don't care." Cindy's story is the story of Waffle House's labor model. It's a story of what I came to call the $3 hour trap. Here's how the system works. And it's brilliant for Waffle House, but it's absolutely devastating for workers like Cindy. Waffle House pays its servers what's known as a tipped wage. This is a sub-minimum wage that, in some states, can be as low as $2.13 an hour. At the time of a major labor complaint in 2024, many Waffle House servers were making just under $3 an hour. The idea, legally, is that customer tips will make up the difference, bringing their total earnings up to at least the federal minimum wage. This is common in the restaurant industry. But here's the catch. The loophole that Waffle House drives a truck through. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, this tipped wage is only supposed to apply to hours spent doing tip-generating work, that is, serving customers. If an employee spends a significant amount of their time doing non-tipped work, their employer is legally required to pay them the full federal or state minimum wage. So, let's follow a Waffle House server through a typical shift. Let's call her Maria. Maria clocks in for her 8-hour shift. For the first hour, there are no customers. So her manager tells her to start her side work. She has to brew the coffee, stock the napkins and silverware, wipe down all the tables and counters, clean the bathrooms, and mop the floor. This is all non-tipped work. Then, the morning rush starts. For the next few hours, she's serving customers, taking orders, refilling drinks. This is tipped work. But in between customers, she's told to wash dishes in the back because the dishwasher called out sick. This is non-tipped work. Later, a cook gets overwhelmed, so the manager tells her to jump on the grill and cook a few orders herself. This is definitely non-tipped work. At the end of her 8-hour shift, Maria has spent maybe 4.5 hours actually serving customers. The other 3.5 hours were spent doing the work of a cleaner, a dishwasher, and a line cook, all jobs that legally require at least minimum wage. But when she gets her paycheck, Waffle House has paid her the $3 tipped wage for all 8 hours. They have effectively forced her to subsidize their own operating costs. They've offloaded the labor costs of 3 different jobs onto a single, underpaid server and are relying on the generosity of customers to make up the difference. This isn't a mistake. This isn't an oversight. This is the system. The Union of Southern Service Workers, or USSW, filed a complaint with the Department of Labor alleging this exact practice is happening at Waffle House locations all across the country. And the numbers are staggering. The USSW estimates that this practice of illegal wage theft robs Waffle House employees of somewhere between $15.6 million and $46.8 million in unpaid wages every single year. Let me repeat that. Up to $46 million stolen from the pockets of their lowest paid workers. This isn't just a number on a page. This is the human cost. This is why, when I was interviewing workers, I heard the same stories over and over again. Stories of workers living in weekly rate motels because they can't afford the security deposit for an apartment. Stories of servers skipping meals so their children can eat. Stories of cooks coming into work sick, coughing over the grill because they can't afford to take an unpaid day off. One former employee, a single mother who asked to remain anonymous for fear of retaliation, told me a story that has haunted me. Her son had a severe asthma attack, and she needed to take him to the emergency room. She called her manager to say she couldn't come in. The manager told her if she didn't show up for her shift, she'd be fired. She had no paid sick leave. She had no choice. She had to leave her sick child with a neighbor and go to work, crying the entire way because losing that $3 an hour job meant losing the roof. This is the reality behind the cheap bacon and egg. The value that Waffle House offers its customers is extracted directly from the livelihood of employees. When confronted about these practices by news organizations and labor unions, Waffle House's corporate response is consistently evasive. They issue boilerplate statements about being proud of the service their employees provide and that they provide a competitive wage and benefits package. They talk about their Waffle House fame, but their response completely misses the point. It deflects from the core allegation that their entire business model is predicated on a form of wage theft, while hard to prove on a case-by-case basis, is systematically depriving their workforce of millions of dollars. The competitive wage they speak of is often illegally suppressed, and the family they claim to be is one that, as Cindy Smith put it, simply doesn't care when you need it most. The workers aren't asking for a handout. They're asking for the money they are legally owed for the work they have already done. And the company's refusal to acknowledge this fundamental truth first, and perhaps most damning piece of the puzzle. But wage theft, as I soon learned, was just the beginning of the story. It was the quiet, insidious foundation upon which a much louder, more chaotic, and more dangerous reality was. What I found next was even more disturbing, because it moved from financial exploitation to a direct threat to the physical safety of both employees and customers. If you spend any time on the internet, you've seen the video. A brawl breaks out at 3 a.m. Chairs are flying. A customer jumps over the counter to attack a cook. A server, barely out of her teens, bravely defends herself against a group of aggressive, intoxicated men. These Waffle House fight videos have become a meme, a running joke about the chaos that supposedly defines the restaurant. We laugh, we share, we move on. But what if it's not just a joke? What if that chaos is a direct and inevitable result of the company's business model? I started cataloging these incidents. I spent days compiling viral video, news reports of assaults, and police records from jurisdictions across the country. I stopped counting after I logged over 500 violent incidents in the past few years alone. 500. And that's just the ones that were reported or went viral. The pattern was undeniable. Waffle House isn't just a restaurant. It's a flashpoint for violence. To understand why, I spoke to a former night shift worker from a location in Florida. Let's call him James. James worked the graveyard shift for 2 years. He agreed to speak with me on the condition of anonymity, because he still lives in the same town and fears for his safety. His voice on the phone was low and tense, even months after he'd quit. He told me, "Imagine going to work every night knowing that it could be your last." That's not an exaggeration. That's the job. He described his nightly routine. He'd arrive around 10 p.m. For the first few hours, it was quiet. But after the local bars closed at 2 a.m., the dynamic would shift instantly. It's like a switch flips, he said. You get waves of people all drunk, all amped up, and the littlest thing can set them off. An order taking too long, someone thinking another person looked at them the wrong way, and suddenly, you're in the middle of it. He told me about one night, a night that he says is the reason he finally quit. A group of men came in, clearly intoxicated and aggressive. They started harassing the lone female server on duty. James, who was cooking, told them to leave her alone. One of the men didn't like that. He walked behind the counter, pulled out a pocket knife, and told James he was going to cut him. There was no security guard. There was no panic button. It was just James, the server, and a man with a knife. James said he grabbed a hot frying pan off the grill, the only thing he could think of to defend himself. The man eventually backed down, and when James told his manager what happened the next day, expecting sympathy or at least a promise of increased security, the manager's response was, "Well, you handled it. Nothing happened. So what's the problem?" This isn't just bad luck. This is by design. Think about the business model. You have a 24/7 operation, which guarantees you'll be one of the few places open when the bars let it. You have a workforce paid poverty-level wages, which leads to high turnover and less experienced. And most critically, you have a corporate policy that, in most locations, refuses to invest in professional security, because that would eat into their profit margin. You combine alcohol, minimal staffing, and a lack of security, and violence isn't a possibility, it's an inevitability. The company has made a cold, financial calculation. They have decided that the risk to their employees' lives is a more acceptable cost than paying for a security guard to keep them safe. This culture of neglect extends beyond just violence. It seeps into the very food the restaurants serve. While I was digging through public records, I started pulling health inspection reports. While many Waffle House locations passed their inspections without issue, I found a disturbing number that failed and failed spectacularly. Let's take a look at a real-world example from a Waffle House in Lawrenceville, Georgia. A health inspector walked in and found a laundry list of critical violations, the kind that lead directly to foodborne illness. The report documented an employee handling raw steak with gloved hands, then using those same contaminated gloves to handle ready-to-eat toast. That's a textbook recipe for E. coli. They found cold-holding foods like eggs and cheese being kept in the temperature danger zone above 41 degrees, where bacteria can multiply rapidly. They found unwashed produce being stored directly above containers of ready-to-eat. They found the staff using a single, dirty, unsanitized towel to wipe down every single table in the restaurant, effectively turning it into a germ delivery device. And the consequences of these failures are real. While researching on Reddit, I found a detailed post from a man whose fiancée had to be hospitalized for a week with severe food poisoning after eating at their local Waffle House. He described a meal where the eggs were cooked wrong twice. The order was missing items, and the general state of the kitchen was, in his words, disgusting. They ended up in the emergency room. Her illness was so severe that doctors had to run tests for salmonella and other dangerous. The pattern becomes clear when you realize that these two issues, violence and food safety, stem from the same root cause. It is a business model that prioritizes profit above all else. Cutting corners on security to save money leads to violence. Cutting corners on staff training, equipment maintenance, and food safety protocols to save money leads to illness. In both cases, the company is gambling with the health and safety of its employees and its customers. And from the evidence, it's a gamble they are willing to take over and over again. The year was 2004, and the Johnson family, a black family from Georgia, just wanted to get some breakfast. They walked into their local Waffle House, sat down at a table, and waited to be served. And they waited, and they waited. A few minutes later, a group of white customers came in and sat down at the table next to them. A server immediately went over, took their order, and brought them coffee. The Johnsons continued to wait. They tried to flag down a server, but they were ignored. After nearly half an hour of being treated as if they were invisible, they got up and they later filed a lawsuit against Waffle House for racial discrimination. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a single story in a 40-year saga of Waffle House looking the other way. As I dug deeper into the company's history, I found a clear and undeniable pattern of racial controversy. Over the last 4 decades, Waffle House has been sued at least 10 times for alleged racial discrimination against black customers and employees. Lawsuit after lawsuit tells the same story. Black customers being refused service, being forced to pay for their food up front when white customers were not, being subjected to racial slurs from staff, or being violently removed by police for no legitimate reason. This is an ancient history. The problem has continued, and in the age of smartphones, it has become impossible for the company to hide. In 2018, the issue exploded into the national consciousness with a series of viral videos. In one, a young, unarmed black man named Anthony Wall was choked and slammed to the ground by a police officer inside a Waffle House in Tennessee. His crime? Arguing with an employee. In another video from a location in Alabama, a black woman named Shakezia Clemens was wrestled to the ground by 3 white police officers, her dress pulled down to expose her breasts, after she had questioned an extra charge for plastic utensils. The incidents were so frequent and so egregious that Bernice A. King, the daughter of civil rights icon Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., felt compelled to speak out. She called for a national boycott of Waffle House, urging people to stay away until the company took meaningful, concrete action to address what she saw as a deep-seated problem of systemic racism. Think about the weight of that. The daughter of the man who fought and died for racial equality in America looked at this restaurant chain and saw a problem so severe that she had to call for a boycott. As I analyzed these incidents, I realized this wasn't just about a few bad apple employees. This was a pattern spanning decades and crossing state lines. It pointed to a corporate culture that either implicitly condoned this behavior or was grossly negligent in preventing it. Fast food restaurants, particularly in the American South, have always been social flashpoints where the country's racial tensions play out in public. But the sheer volume and consistency of these incidents at Waffle House suggests something deeper is at play. The company's response is always the same. They release a statement saying they are investigating the incident, that they do not tolerate discrimination of any kind, and that they are working with local authorities. But the lawsuits keep coming. The viral videos keep surfacing. The stories from Black customers who feel profiled, disrespected, and endangered in their restaurants continue to pile up. It became clear to me that the problem of discrimination at Waffle House wasn't a bug. It was a feature of a culture that has been allowed to fester for decades. It's the third, and perhaps the most shameful, head of the monster. A failure not just of policy, but of morality. A 40-year-long track record of looking the other way while its Black customers and employees were being harmed. After 3 months of research, after all the interviews, the documents, and the data, I finally saw it. I had been looking at wage theft, violence, and discrimination as 3 separate problems. But they weren't. They were all symptoms of the same disease. They were all the predictable outcomes of a single, deeply flawed business. It all connected. Here's the pattern that connects everything. First, Waffle House operates primarily on a franchise model. This is a brilliant way to diffuse responsibility. When a major incident happened, a lawsuit for wage theft, a violent assault, a discrimination claim, corporate headquarters can distance itself. They can claim it was the fault of an individual franchise owner, that it doesn't reflect the company as a whole. This creates a system with a profound lack of accountability, where systemic change is nearly impossible because the problem is always framed as someone else's. Second, the entire brand is built on one thing: low prices. To maintain those incredibly low profit, you have to cut corners somewhere. And Waffle House cuts corners on the things that matter most. They cut corners on labor by creating a system that systematically underpays its workers. They cut corners on safety by refusing to invest in adequate security or staff training. And they cut corners on oversight by allowing a culture to develop where discrimination can go unchecked for decades. Every problem I uncovered could be traced back to this relentless pressure to keep costs as low as humanly possible. And third, the 24/7 operating model. While it's a great marketing hook, it creates an impossibly high-pressure environment. It guarantees a constant influx of the most challenging customers. It necessitates a skeletal staff working grueling, dangerous hours. It creates the perfect petri dish for all of these other problems to flourish. This is the big picture. This is the unified theory of Waffle House's fears. It's a business model that is a masterclass in externalizing costs. The company reaps the profits, while the true costs are paid by others. So here's what Waffle House's cheap prices actually cost. They cost workers like Cindy Smith millions of dollars in stolen wages every year. They cost workers like James their physical safety and mental well-being. They cost customers who get sick from contaminated food their health and their hospital bill. They cost Black families like the Johnsons their dignity and their right to be treated as equal. Every $5 All-Star special is subsidized. It's subsidized by the unpaid labor of a server, by the fear of a cook working the night shift, by the risk a customer takes every time they eat there, and by the decades of pain inflicted upon a community the company claims to serve. That is the true cost. When I started this investigation, I just wanted to understand why a restaurant I, like so many others, had a certain fondness for seemed to have so many problems. I thought I was investigating a restaurant chain. What I found was something much bigger than that. I found a case study in the hidden costs of convenience. A story about how a business model that looks successful on paper could be a model of human failure in practice. Now you have the information. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the stories. You understand the pattern that connects the wage theft, the violence, the neglect, and the discrimination. It all stems from the same place. A business model that has made a conscious decision that its profits are more important than its people. I'm not here to tell you what to do. A boycott is a personal choice, but you can no longer say you don't know. You can no longer sit in that vinyl booth and be unaware of the true cost of the meal in front of you. The question is, what are you going to do with this information? Are you going to continue to participate in a system that you now know is built on a foundation of exploitation? That 2 a.m. Reddit thread led me down a rabbit hole that changed how I see not just Waffle House, but how we think about the true cost of cheap food. And it forced me to ask a difficult question, and now I'm asking you to do the same. When you look at that glowing yellow sign, what do you see now? Do you see a beacon of comfort and nostalgia? Or do you see a warning? A warning about a company that has, for far too long, gotten away with serving up a side of human misery with every order. The choice is yours.